Being here, I'd like to thank Professor Steffen Förding and the rest of the faculty and staff of the Institut für Theologie und Religionswissenschaft for inviting me here this evening. The event that really inspired my interest in the rhetoric of the American Christian right was actually the birth of my first child. I was no more than a year into my PhD program whenever she was born, and although at moments I was able to convince myself that having a baby wouldn't be that disruptive, because at that point I thought that babies slept a lot, once she was here I found out how very wrong that I was. From the moment of her birth, I was flung into a new and very unknown territory where I was constantly trying to figure out a way to balance my personal life with my professional academic one. I consistently felt that I was doing neither thing very well, and my first dose of parenting guilt was a very bitter pill indeed, as we say. Now, ironically, the research that I was doing at the time made me feel even worse. For the several years prior to my pregnancy, I had studied the perspectives on sex, gender, and family that underscored the activism of the fundamentalist Christian right in America. The Christian right, also known by some as the religious right, is the name given to a coalition of American political action groups, which has been in existence in one form or another for about 50 or so years. Now, religiously speaking, the movement is typically characterized by members who talk about Jesus as a personal savior, who claim to take the Bible seriously, if not literally, who advocate the importance of spreading the gospel or evangelizing others, and who also understand America as an originally Christian country whose citizens have an obligation to preserve that religiosity in every aspect of their politics and culture. These religious positions are often understood to translate into a series of conservative political platforms, including opposition to gay rights and abortion rights, opposition to big government, and opposition to feminism more generally. So about the time that my daughter was born, I had just begun to research one particularly powerful Christian right group called Concerned Women for America, which also goes by the acronym CWA. And from this point on, I'll simply refer to it as CWA. CWA describes itself as the nation's largest public policy women's organization. And indeed, from a numbers perspective, it probably is. The founder of CWA is down here. Her name is Beverly LaHaye. I'll talk about her more in just a second. But the rest of these are images that CWA very freely uses within the American media. You can see the two women up here in the upper right are some of the representatives of CWA, and they are very prominently positioned on many major American news media outlets. So we're talking about people with a great deal of visibility, in other words. But what makes CWA distinct from other Christian right groups is that their membership is composed primarily of women, and they have longevity and political power that few other conservative organizations have enjoyed. I have a friend who was a Kansas state senator. Kansas is the state in which I live. And for many years, she remarked that there was not a week that went by that she did not receive some sort of mail, some sort of post from CWA. Those letters and later the emails urged her to vote a particular way on a bill. They reminded her that she was the focus of their prayers, and they warned her of the implications of what would happen if she marked her ballot in the wrong way. In addition to their lobbying efforts, both grassroots and organized, CWA representatives are frequently featured as what we call the talking heads, just like this. The talking heads on major news outlets, they're often called experts who testify in front of Congress on important pieces of legislation, often having to do with women's or family-related topics. And they have even been named as delegates to the United Nations, lobbying on behalf of a variety of conservative social issues. CWA was actually founded in 1979 by preacher's wife turned political activist Beverly LaHaye. Again, that's the woman in your far right corner in the blue. Like her husband Tim LaHaye, who is best known by many as the co-author of the Left Behind series of apocalyptic novels, much of Beverly LaHaye's public career has been spent as a writer. She was known early on for her opposition to feminism and to the idea that the National Organization of Women, which is America's premier feminist organization, also called NOW, N-O-W, and she was also opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, which was a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would have guaranteed legal gender equity, and which, by the way, was finally failed after decades and decades of attempted passage. This disapproval led to her early career writing motivational books for women, facing the many choices that feminism had recently made possible in 1960s and 1970s America. Now, during those decades, Beverly LaHaye was something like a modern-day prophetess, sounding the call to scores of American women about the dangers posed by what she considered the godless doctrine of secular humanism, and as she saw it, its twin offspring, communism and feminism. In the vision she offered, God created an ordered and exacting world where men are men and women are women. And to threaten such order with feminist liberation, abortion, gay rights, or even governmental aid programs was to ultimately undermine not only the authority of the Christian family, but also the country itself. The source of my own discomfort, though, had to do with her advice to women of reproductive age. In many of her books, she warns young mothers of the dangers that come if they are employed. In particular, she notes that being away from one's child for any extended period of time creates what she calls a psychological orphan. For a woman to forfeit her identity over to the feminist drive towards career liberation and independence, she says, guarantees children whose souls are dry and empty from emotional abandonment, even if their backs are clothed. As a new mother struggling with a decision to return to work, these were words I just didn't need to hear, even though I found them completely outdated and illogical. In the same breath, she also blames parental neglect and abuse, and here she calls working mothers neglectful. So that's the context in which she speaks. For causing children to become radical feminists and mass murderers. So radical feminists and mass murderers, two categories that she equates without any explanation. In an equally pointed passage, she recalls a conversation that she overheard in a restaurant where a husband was verbally abusing his wife because he felt that she looked haggard and tired. While LaHaye expressed concern about the harshness of his attack, and she even in one of her books remarks that it ruined her dinner, she ultimately defends his message saying this: who knows how many years he'd been looking at that tired mess? And the tired mess, of course, is his wife, right? With all the helps available today, there's no need for a woman to let herself get into this situation. And here again, she's talking about cosmetically, right? That, you know, that she didn't need to let herself go, as they say. I feel very strongly that when a woman fully accepts herself as a creation God has made, she will do her very best to prune, trim, manicure, and even paint the object of God's love and care. What a pity to see a Christian woman who has developed her inner beauty but has done nothing to the frame she must house it in. So, despite the fact that Beverly LaHaye is now well into her 80s and others have taken over the reins of the organization or the practical day-to-day runnings of the group, the kernel of her original statements still persist in CWA's political platforms. A very quick glance at their website makes it very clear to the reader that from CWA's vantage point, America's arch enemies are feminism, gay rights, abortion activism, and liberalism more generally, to sum it up quite quickly. Now, as a person who identifies as a liberal feminist and who is otherwise very far apart from CWA on almost every social and political issue, it might seem ironic that its extreme words caused me any concern or bother at all. But the more that I read the organization's website, the more I was intrigued by how easily I could allow the logic behind its arguments to work on the guilt and worry in my mind that's so ubiquitous to parenting and family life in general. I will not soon forget dropping my daughter off at her first day of daycare. We were both crying. She was in the classroom and I was in the hallway. And I was momentarily convinced that I was creating a psychological orphan, as Beverly LaHaye had forecasted. And while I don't share CWA's conviction that sex ed programs in public schools will cause teens to have rampant sex, or as CWA has said, will teach them how to have sex, I can relate to the concerns over how my children's future sexual habits will affect their lives. So it was this experience, and a host of many other related ones, that led me to wonder how to explain the emotional appeal of this rhetoric. It was easy enough to explain its appeal to evangelicals and to other Christian conservatives or fundamentalists, for all of this is just, as we say, preaching to the choir, right? It's telling the people who already believe it what they want to hear. But more than this, I wanted to consider what actually occurs in the process of communication that causes very large numbers of people to adopt this information as their own, even when such ideas are not supported by objective evidence, or even whenever they don't personally identify with this particular Christian movement. In other words, why are these ideas so popular, even amongst people who don't consider themselves conservative or fundamentalist American Christians? So, to answer this puzzle, I began to look to some of the models that are currently used to account for conservative political power. Now, religion scholars often argue that such groups are attractive to the public because they provide a very high degree of order and stability in times of rapidly shifting change. And according to these models, people are drawn to strong, rigid, and unchanging beliefs because they offer psychological security, they offer a sense of belonging. And while most every scholar acknowledges that the Christian right uses extreme dichotomous black and white language, almost all of them explain such strong language as a simple sign or a byproduct of very strong beliefs. But things seemed a little bit more complex to me than that, quite frankly. After all, if strong language is the result of strong beliefs, again, how do we account for the millions of Americans who don't share these beliefs, who nevertheless vote according to the strong language? Furthermore, the longer that I spent reading CWA's website, the more I began to question the idea that the Christian right, or that Christian fundamentalism in general, is really characterized by any sort of solid, unchanging, absolute belief, which is a topic that I will shortly return to. So rather, I would suggest that the answer to the persuasive power of groups like this lies with a language, and particularly special qualities of religious language. Now, religion is popularly defined as a worldview or a set of beliefs, and I would like to shift our focus today to think about religion instead as a persuasive rhetorical tactic. So not as things we believe, but as a rhetorical, a verbal strategy used in the world. Now, what I mean by this is that religious rhetoric uses allusions, symbols, and explanations that are distinct in the power continuum of language precisely because they appeal to an external transcendent authority such as God or morality, or in more patriotic moments, the nation. These things are often seen as ultimate, unquestionable, or otherwise indisputably good. The very fact that they're treated as things beyond critique is, for scholar Bruce Lincoln, the very thing that makes them religious. So being beyond critique, not being able to question that thing, is to Lincoln what makes something intrinsically religious. It's not a particular essentialist fact of that thing per se. It has to do with whether or not you can adequately question it. In the American context, religious claims and organizations often hold a certain measure of implied authority that others often don't share because of the importance of religion to American culture. Consider the fact, for instance, that under current US law, 48 out of 50 states permit exemptions from childhood vaccinations for what are called sincere religious beliefs, while only 19 permit exemptions for philosophical beliefs. Those organizations, like CWA, that identify as religious are thus armed with a sort of persuasive ammunition, with persuasive weaponry that other groups simply do not have, culturally speaking. Even for those who are not religious, though, religious terms and concepts can have exceptional power in creating frames of reference. Scholar Susan Harding has noted that although the process of religious conversion is often described as something that happens in the heart, she says it's probably better described as something that happens in the mouth, actually, as a shift in language, is how she puts it. So when we start to show a preference for a certain set of words over others, we are not only showing a change in our own thinking, but we're actually making that change mentally happen. And the more that we use those words, the more that becomes our reality. For instance, is a picture of a naked figure art, or is it obscenity? According to Harding's theory, the more we hear it called art, the more we're going to appreciate its aesthetic value. But the more that we hear it called obscenity, the more we will potentially experience feelings of repulsion, or perhaps excitement, depending on how you see that term. So more to the point, when CWA calls homosexuality sinful, they've characterized sexuality intrinsically as a moral matter, so that now those who seek to disagree with CWA must disagree with this assessment through the language of morality in order to successfully combat the argument. In other words, they must buy into their argument to some degree to battle on their terms. Thus, even if there are those who disagree, CWA has already successfully set the ground rules for the debate. Presuming that words create realities just as much as they describe them, then, I spent the better part of a decade examining a wide array of documents that were published daily on the CWA website to better understand how the language of this particular Christian right group could be so very persuasive. These documents were specifically intended to incite public persuasion. Almost all of them dealt explicitly with sex, gender, or reproduction issues, which are the primary issues that characterize the organization's political platforms. While I saw plenty of strong extreme statements, what I also uncovered was a pattern of rhetorical strategies and structures embedded in the language that result in a type of exceedingly persuasive speech that I call chaos rhetoric. So this is how I approach chaos rhetoric. And to me, it is the centerpiece of CWA's persuasive force. Chaos rhetoric describes a type of highly emotional speech that attempts to persuade an audience that something that they dearly love, for example, something like their children, their nation, their liberties, something of this sort, is being threatened. And in this sense, the emotional power of the rhetoric is that it portrays a world where threat, disorder, fear, and chaos are always around the corner. From a persuasion standpoint, this is a really smart strategy because we know statistically that negative emotions tend to catch our attention and cause us to act far more frequently than do positive ones. But rather than just argue this hell in a handbasket thesis, chaos rhetoric is designed to offer a very specific solution to the problem that it creates. And in providing an answer, it positions the group who created the rhetoric as the embodiment of goodness and stability and order. So to put this slightly differently, when CWA can pose a threat that it says exists on the horizon, it always manufactures the threat in such a way that it has the solution. And its politics is always the solution. So it always knows how to fix the problem that it says exists, whether or not one actually believes that the problem is present. Now, whether urging opposition to a state amendment on gay marriage on the grounds that such marriages will lead to gay adoption and from this child molestation. That's a frequent argument that if you allow gay people to adopt children, they will abuse them. CWA says this frequently. Or speaking out against sex ed in schools, again, using the reasoning that children will be taught how to have sex rather than how to prevent disease or pregnancy. Chaos rhetoric does not persuade by explicitly advertising the superiority of the group's own position. Rather, in something like what we call a backdoor move, it persuades by postulating certain dangers and threats that will happen if the enemy wins. So here's a rather typical example that we'll look at next from a CWA representative who is writing on the dangers that he perceives will transpire if the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, otherwise known in America as the ENDA, that's a bill that's currently up for passage in Congress, but interestingly, this morning, President Obama actually signed a similar bill into legislation bypassing the Congress that prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender status. So even as early as this morning, this is now a little less timely. The goal of the ENDA is to prohibit employment discrimination based on sexual orientation. So in the piece we're going to look at next, the author imagines what will happen if homosexuality becomes mainstream in American culture, and for the sake of context, here he refers to liberals, or who he calls the political left, as people who have no sexual morals. So just so you know, that's who he's referring to. The left has long been at war against sexual morals for good reason. People conditioned to think as short-term opportunists instead of as members of the family tree are easy to manipulate. Just give them the false promise of a painless future free from individual responsibility. Societies that lose respect for marriage eventually lose creative energy derived from the delayed gratification that strengthens families. Instead, people strive for immediate sensory pleasure and societies become less dynamic and fertile. Government grows bigger to pick up the pieces and create grounds for even greater hegemony. Our very survival is at stake, not just our economic well-being. Okay, so let's identify the components of this chaos rhetoric so that you can see how it operates. We have a reviled, dangerous entity, that's homosexuals, right? The beloved entity that's out there is the nation and its heterosexual-led families. And the threat interjected between them, or the threat that unites the two, is the idea that homosexuals are going to take down the nation by themselves. and its economy, too, through a mindset that will lead to government dependency. Okay? Here, the author claims that homosexuals are hedonists by definition. They strive for, quote, immediate sensory pleasure. Thus, homosexuals cannot provide the hard work and self-control necessary to build something like the nation. Homosexuals in this logic are thus not a part of the family tree, with family understood both literally in heterosexual procreative terms and also metaphorically as the tree that is the nation. To the author, those who cannot claim this membership must be short-term opportunists, as opposed to those whose ability to make long-term commitments makes a nation possible. The solution that is posed here is to vote against the ENDA. Okay? And here's another example, this one about the start of a conservative anti-feminist organization on one college campus. The glory of feminism, which engulfed waves of young women in the 1960s and 70s, has increasingly lost its luster with today's generation, many of whom have observed its radical swerve to the left. Today's feminists have embraced an increasingly hostile and denigrating view of the male half of the species, bitterly viewing them as a hindrance to female liberation. Not surprisingly, radical feminists today also devalue the institution of marriage. After all, empowered women don't need men, and they view motherhood with contempt. Many collegiate women have observed the detrimental effects of such attitudes and just aren't buying them. Being feminist is as out of style as crimped hair and big bangs. And this is a reference to 1980s hair. Now, this doesn't sound anything like the feminism that I know, nor the feminism that any of my colleagues know. And this is particularly true for those of us feminists who are married to men and have children. But this is one important point about chaos rhetoric. The concern is not factual accuracy, it's persuasive value. So here the reviled entity is modern feminism, which CWA denotes as threatening by calling it radical. The beloved entity is conservative college women, and the threat interjected between them is that modern feminists will create a hostile, anti-family environment on college campuses if they're permitted to do so. The solution here in this particular piece of rhetoric is to oppose feminism as something out of date and out of touch. Now, it may seem like chaos rhetoric is nothing other than a simple fear tactic. But calling this phenomenon a fear tactic hardly begins to tell the whole story when we're trying to understand how political groups intentionally and effectively persuade the public. The term chaos rhetoric highlights not only the often hyperbolic, exaggerated nature of the speech, and I think you have seen thus far that many of these arguments are quite exaggerated and don't have a good fit with reality per se, but it also reveals its shifting character. What is chaotic in one cultural circumstance or time is a complete non-event. It's not at all interesting in another. This means that groups that wish to maintain social power and public relevancy must constantly renegotiate the content and the style of their message if they're going to maintain a very high degree of emotional appeal. So here's an example. If CWA can successfully portray homosexuality as a public health threat, which it is often done through studies that show an elevated risk for domestic violence among gay couples, or through other studies that pinpoint elevated suicide rates among gay teens. So these studies exist out there. Ironically, the cause for most of these things is the harassment that they face from groups like CWA, but that's, of course, not discussed. So if CWA can portray homosexuality as a public health threat, then it's not too difficult to shift support away from gay rights. But as that particular message grows stale or loses public appeal or is otherwise simply debunked, it's abandoned for a new one that accomplishes a similar effect. But once that effect is no longer possible to maintain, the group will be pushed to rework its stance on homosexuality, even if incrementally, so as to preserve its public relevancy. In this case, that might mean the shift from seeing homosexual identity as a sin to regarding just the practice of homosexual sex as a sin. That nuance, however slight, provides the group what we call some wiggle room to give the material to work with in crafting a new rhetoric. So no matter the strategy du jour, this rhetorical technique involves creating a very specific image of the enemy as a threat to a very clear, self-evident order, and then portraying itself, CWA, as the entity that not only embodies that order, but that can heroically fix whatever problem is out there. So chaos rhetoric works because it focuses on the persuasive negative elements of an issue, and it's always shape-shifting as the times demand. Yet finding a consistent structure in the language doesn't necessarily make the content of the message believable. I could carry on all evening about the existence of aliens, and even if I talk about the constant threat that aliens pose to human civilization, you're not really likely to believe my message unless you already came in here believing in aliens, right? So there has to be something more. There has to be more convincing proof that makes certain attitudes and certain concepts applicable and relevant. Scholar Linda Kintz has applied the philosophical concept of resonance to explain how this works. Resonance is a term that she uses to explain how people come to lend political support to a message that they may otherwise find unbelievable in a different context. In its more popular use, the word resonance refers to an acoustical event where sound is intensified through a number of sympathetic vibrations. When applied as a metaphor to describe conservative groups, Kintz argues that resonance occurs when very large numbers of people with otherwise very different interests are drawn together and their political power is synthesized through emotional appeals that they all find similarly attractive or threatening, even if they do that for very different reasons. This is also why CWA does often not solely use overt religious rhetoric to endorse its platforms. That line of reasoning is simply not as persuasive as another argument that appeals to the religious and the non-religious alike. They must always, in a word, appear mainstream. So over the 10 years that I read the CWA website, I rarely found an argument that was posed there that began by saying, we must vote in this way because this is what God wants. God's name was rarely drawn into the conversation. Instead, there were certain conversations about public health and the preservation of liberties and the preservation of the family and the maintenance of civil rights and other far more mainstream labels such as this. So, for instance, to give you an example of resonance, if a TV advertisement warns viewers that God hates abortion at the same time as it shows pictures of aborted fetuses, okay, then many people are likely to be persuaded, but for a very wide variety of reasons. Some may be swayed by the religious argument alone. God said no, I hate this, right? So that on one level may work. Others, however, only have to be horrified by the image. It doesn't matter whatever logic is being used. The image itself is gory or is repulsive enough in order to create the desired effect. Or, perhaps even more likely, the person can't pinpoint why she or he feels compelled to vote against abortion rights. It just seems like a gut feeling or the right thing to do. So people who are not lockstep adherents to conservative political issues may nevertheless add to the power of Christian fundamentalism in America, even if they're only mildly sympathetic to some of its positions, and even if for a variety of reasons they can be persuaded to vote in a particular way. So even if readers don't fully agree with CWA's argument, the uneasy feelings, the general malaise that can be left by their rhetoric lingers as something like an emotional investment that can be cashed in when needed by the group to elicit a political effect. So the potential for creating highly resonant pieces of rhetoric is amplified when the topic is particularly controversial or high stakes, and sex is one such issue, particularly for Americans. There is no better way to start a controversy or a rumor than to suggest that it has something to do with sex. No other basic bodily function is assigned such weighty significance. Indeed, Americans often refer to breaking the sexual rules as the ultimate moral violation. Now, why we give sex such an exalted place in our cultural morality is a topic of very considerable substance. But suffice it to say here what Janet Jacobson has said about the matter, which is sex is not about sex per se. What Jacobson is getting at is that our cultural tensions about sex, including everything from our personal relationships and alliances, to our gender roles, to our reproductive abilities, all of this is critical to the shape and to the control of American culture at large, and to the way that citizens in that culture come to understand themselves and their social worth. We've been taught about sexuality as a compelling story that we've made into one of ultimate importance. So when something is rhetorically connected to sex, it's upping the persuasive ante. It's lending far more authority to the argument than the argument might on its own have already had. But all of this still doesn't answer the critical question of how one gets the public to logically kind of connect the dots, so to speak, translating these widespread and negative messages into a coherent political statement that changes votes. I would suggest that chaos rhetoric employs 4 underlying rhetorical strategies that are very critical to the persuasive process. In other words, these strategies help the reader translate the organization's position into their own position. And these include polarization, defensive argumentation, rationale, deflection, and urgency. A couple of these I think that you will find to be quite common in terms of how most groups pose persuasive rhetoric, and a couple of them are probably more unique to the way that CWA operates. So the first strategy is polarization. Now, the success of most rhetorical projects depends on the audience taking sides. Are you for this team or are you for that team? One must choose, after all. So the discourse that a group creates is first and foremost designed to designate lines of social distinction. You stand for this, I stand for that, I'm right, you're wrong. Political power, understood in terms of votes, community activism, rallies, and phone calls, is typically the result, perhaps obviously, of strong feelings, not lukewarm sentiment. And so the world must be portrayed as very clean-cut, very black and white, so as to make the group's strong views and their logic appear to be natural, appear to be a course of reality. So for instance, this is actually the employment application, or a portion of the employment application, that is required for college students who are wanting to be college interns with Concerned Women for America. CWA's headquarters are in Washington, D.C., and there are many, many fine, prestigious universities in Washington, D.C., and so they've set up a college intern program, and they have interns come in and out and work for them and also do lobbying on Capitol Hill for them as a part of their college experience. So on this employment application required of prospective CWA college interns, the applicants are asked to answer a true-false style quiz that engages their level of agreement with certain issues. These include statements such as, and I don't have that one on here, but here's one that's quite popular. Women who stay at home to raise a family are missing out, true or false? And the US Constitution is an evolving document that must adapt to today's needs, true or false? Now, there's no possibility for an essay answer. In other words, you can't take a pen and write a sentence anywhere. It is fully implied that a T or an F is absolutely all that you need to answer the question. The irony is missed on another true-false question which asks the applicant to respond to the following. Right and wrong is never black and white. It's important to consider the shades of gray in any decision. Presumably, one does not get the job at CWA if one answers true to that one. So we can also see polarization in this next passage, which is a more traditional display of chaos rhetoric. Here, a CWA representative is expressing disapproval, this is from several years ago, over the state of Iowa, over its Supreme Court's decision to strike down a law that limited marriage to heterosexual relationships, and which thus paved the way for Iowa's vote in favor of gay marriage. Iowa was, by the way, the second state in the US to defeat laws that said that marriages had to be between heterosexual couples. And so what this particular writer was concerned about is predictably precisely what has happened, which is now that we have a full third, working, some would say, to half of the American states that have struck down basically bans on gay marriage. So this writer says this. This case proves once again that the only way to assure that the institution of marriage is protected in Iowa is to pass a constitutional marriage amendment. And by constitutional marriage amendment, this means an amendment to the state constitution that says that marriage must be between one man and one woman. So he, in this case, is endorsing this. Any legislator not willing to sponsor such a bill is proving their loyalty with political agendas and not with the people of Iowa, or not the intent of our founding fathers. Now, this may seem to be simple description, right, or a person's simple opinion, but this is actually a piece of chaos rhetoric at work. Because the underlying premise, of course, is that both heterosexual marriage and the will of the founding fathers represent a united front that will be threatened by the legalization of gay marriage. And now the reader has a choice, and here's where polarization comes in. The reader can stand on the side of political agendas, here read as selfish politicking. Or they can stand on the self-evident good of the average American and American principles as implied in the statements, the people and the founding fathers. In this sense, the term any legislator does not literally function specifically as a comment on the government official, because it's the audience's role in this conflict to incite resolution. It's the audience's job to become a piece of this rhetoric themselves and to respond appropriately. Either the audience will choose to side with political whims, or it will follow true patriotism. Under the terms of this type of speech, it's impossible to assert that legalizing gay marriage can be understood as a patriotic act. Through this perspective, the reader cannot identify with CWA's opponent while still considering her or himself reasonable and moral. The second tactic is one called defensive argumentation. Defensive argumentation is probably one of the most important functions of chaos rhetoric, if not its fundamental expression. The metaphorical eye is directed away from one subject and onto another so that the first subject can do its work in the background, relatively unnoticed. I like to think of this as the rhetorical equivalent of wearing camouflage. If a group can deflect attention away from itself and onto something else, that is its opponents, then it can more imperceptibly smooth over its own ambiguities, inconsistencies, in its own platforms, often by renegotiating how it uses certain words or concepts. This is of actually quite critical importance for groups that are constantly talking about how their platforms are eternal and true, because frankly, they've got to change over time if they're going to keep up with the culture, sometimes in very fundamental ways. So although defensive argumentation is useful for hiding indiscretions, this particular strategy also allows a group to change its actual persona, its actual public face, as is needed to maintain relevancy and interest. Since, as we established, negative emotions evoke a much stronger response than positive ones, this means that the real persuasive force of chaos rhetoric lies in knowing how to repeatedly rework an opponent's identity so that the opponent is constantly threatening, is constantly dangerous, but so that CWA is always the hero, is always standing up for justice, is always standing up for rights, and is always thus continuously attractive. So this is the reason for my earlier comment that I question the notion that the Christian right is characterized by unchanging core beliefs, that everything is absolute, that all of their positions are eternal. In fact, I think that if there's one thing I would conclude after having closely read their website for, again, a decade, it was that I could not find such rigid stability at all. What I found was a consistently changing message. Things were stable, perhaps in appearances alone, but that stability would shift as the political winds shifted as well. So here's an example. Earlier, I gave you an example of how in the 1960s and 1970s, Beverly LaHaye talked about working motherhood. It would create the psychological orphan. It was a form of child abuse. It would guarantee feminists and mass murderers, an entire generation of them, right? All of these things were posed as very legitimate threats that would be the result of working motherhood. And so for a major part of her public career, really she was writing like this well into the late 1980s. She rejected this as a viable option, a point driven home by the fact that for many years her official biography ended with a sentence that deliberately said, Mrs. LaHaye did not enter into public life until her children were grown, period. Now, happily, because, well, at the time it didn't feel happy, but I studied the CWA website for so long that I actually even had the privilege of watching her biography shift. After a few years, that sentence was removed and no longer featured there as CWA grew and as, frankly, it became staffed by working mothers. So because CWA's staff today is comprised primarily or largely of working mothers, the organization now insists that they don't demand that women stay home. They simply want to tell women that they have the option of stay-at-home motherhood if this is something that they so wish. And they also want to say that liberal feminists want nothing more than to make sure that no woman stays home with her child. Now, again, here we have an example of something that if we match it with reality, we don't find a lot of cohesive match. But again, the point is not factual accuracy, the point is persuasive value. So as further evidence of this sort of linguistic manipulation, consider the fact that for most of its 30-plus-year history, CWA has used the word feminism in a pejorative or negative light to denote its liberal female opponents. But with the recent widespread acceptance of many of the principles of feminism, as well, frankly, as its desire to attract a younger crowd, CWA's membership is very quickly aging. And so in the last 5 years, they have begun intensive campaigns on college campuses to start up conservative, they're actually called YWA, Young Women for America, to start YWA chapters. CWA has taken a serious about-face on how it treats the term feminism. Rather than just categorically rejecting the term as it once did, CWA now asserts that it is itself the embodiment of true feminism, tracing its ideological lineage back to the early 20th century feminists who were fighting for voting rights and women's education. On the other hand, CWA says that modern or liberal feminists are fake feminists. And this piece of chaos rhetoric that we're going to look at here establishes that distinction for us. So This particular CWA commentator says this: unlike the early feminist goals, modern feminism's agenda is based on a foundation, and by the way, sorry, modern feminism is defined as liberal feminism. Modern feminism's agenda is based on a foundation of separation and anger, rather than equality and fairness. So do you see how the chaos rhetoric is working? We find the enemy, we manipulate their appearance or their persona in such a way that then makes it so that we are the convenient solution to the problem, right? Today's feminists wrongly claim kinship to feminism's founders, thereby cloaking their radicalism in the early movement's popularity and moral authority. Early feminists looked at the world through reason. Modern feminists see everything through a gender prism. Or if we're going to more clearly break that down, the opposite of reason is illogic. So modern feminists are illogical. CWA, that is, conservative feminists, embody reason. Early feminists did not view men as the enemy. Modern feminists believe that men are their constant oppressors. Early feminists saw marriage and motherhood as privileges. Modern feminists see the family as a prison. Early feminists saw abortion as exploitation of women. Modern feminists see it as a solution to the problem of exploitation. Okay, so here we have some really interesting rhetorical juxtapositions that introduce a very specific threat, which then allows CWA to repaint its own image in a much more flattering, dynamic, and extraordinary way than it had before. So in this particular form of chaos rhetoric, the author equates early feminism with, and take a peek particularly at this bulleted list, early feminism is equated with reason, tolerance, family, and the social and physical protection of women from sexist exploitation. Ironically, those are the things that modern feminism actually claims to do, right? But according to the way that CWA has recast or has reimagined modern liberal feminism here, liberal feminists cannot link themselves to this early good feminist movement because according to this piece of logic, they oppose all of its terms. So it's CWA, rather, that can solve the problem by genealogically, by creating a family relationship whereby it connects itself with this early feminist movement, and thereby it completely remodels its own image. Such a self-renovation is possible only to the degree that its negative characterizations of modern feminism, though, are first effective. Put differently, this line of reasoning only works if you first believe that its portrayals of its enemy are accurate. And this is why chaos rhetoric depends so heavily on the portrayal of an enemy, so that the group itself can, again, wearing its rhetorical camouflage, shift more imperceptibly behind the scenes. Now, another deflective mechanism used in chaos rhetoric is the relocation of a group's rationale. And in this technique, CWA chaos rhetoric uses one sort of rationale to justify why it engages in political advocacy, when actually it's probably far more likely that there is an underlying but less persuasive reason why it's engaging in activism in the way that it does. So for the past several years, CWA has conducted a very focused campaign against a vaccination called Gardasil. This is an immunization against one form of the human papillomavirus, which is a sexually transmitted disease. It has been known for quite a while to cause some forms of cervical cancer that can lead not only to infertility but also to death, at least in women, and can also cause exposure and also disease problems in men. So as early as 2005, before Gardasil was ever on the American market, CWA was very, very excited because the American CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, released a public statement that says, HPV does cause cervical cancer. Up to that point, the connection had been a bit tenuous. So when in 2005, the CDC releases a public statement, yes, if you have unprotected sex, or even if you have protected sex with a condom, you could still catch HPV. CWA was thrilled with this pronouncement. CWA then subsequently wrote an article that says, the facts about HPV once again reveal the wisdom in God's plan for faithful marriages. The only 100% sure prevention is sexual abstinence until one enters a mutually monogamous marriage with an uninfected person. Sex outside of marriage brings many health risks, including high-risk types of HPV. It's about time that the CDC has come forward and started to be honest with women about the connections among promiscuity, STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, and cancer. So when this came out in 2005, I was still reading the CWA website. And for months, there was nothing that consumed this website but this. Everything was about the CDC's connection between premarital sex and cancer, right? And so that's the rhetorical equation that, as we can simply see, is being built here. So the chaos rhetoric is quite clear. There is improper sex. Cancer is the result. But that rhetoric had to shift quite strongly whenever Gardasil was introduced to the market. CWA then began a very virulent campaign against the use of the vaccine, despite the fact that it was the one who had earlier called this cervical cancer dangerous and high risk. Now, its primary complaint against Gardasil has actually been threefold. First, it asserts that mandated Gardasil vaccinations, or required Gardasil vaccinations, as were enacted, for instance, across the entire state of Texas, which is one of the US's largest states, infringe on parents' rights to control their medical treatment. So the first argument that they're saying is, you know, hands off government. If you force kids to have the HPV vaccine, then you are infringing on parents' rights. You're violating our civil liberties, in other words, okay? The second is that they claim that Gardasil has risky side effects that may actually harm rather than promote the health of the teens who take it. And like almost all vaccines, there is a small risk for some odd, usually harmless side effects. They've had a couple of teens who have fainted. I think there have been 2 reports of the now millions of Gardasil that have been given, maybe 2 reports of paralysis, but still, frankly, in keeping with line with kind of the normal risk associated with vaccination. And finally, they say that Gardasil provides teens with a false sense of security because the length of its actual usefulness remains unknown. It's still not particularly clear how long the vaccine protects one against HPV. However, in almost every article that against Gardasil, there is a fourth, very briefly mentioned complaint, and that is that we shouldn't be giving Gardasil to our kids because it's going to make them have sex. And that's simply what it is. It removes one negative ramification of extramarital sex, and so we just can't be doing that. Now, that actually appears to be the primary rationale behind why CWA is engaging in this sort of advocacy. It appears to be the dominant rationale about the drug, actually. So here's why. On a very basic level, before the vaccine was released, CWA's main way of discouraging premarital sex was to say premarital sex will give you cancer, right? But since HPV can now be avoided with this vaccination, another tactic was probably far more attractive to a mainstream American audience. That is, frame Gardasil as a big government move with possible health side effects to boot. If CWA's true interests were really invested in parents' rights or risky side effects or ineffective vaccines, then it seems logical that it would have been a very vocal contributor to the still raging debate over the safety of many other almost always nationwide mandated vaccines, such as the ones that all American school children have to receive before they enter school. Rather, controlling sex and the terms under which it actually happens appears to be of preeminent concern, and not the concern over big government, truncated civil rights, or any other issue. A fourth tactic of CWA's chaos rhetoric is to create such a degree of threat that the reader is actually compelled to respond in a way that makes an immediate political impact. For CWA, prompting activism often occurs in very overt ways, such as providing the reader contact information for a government official. And by the way, if you sign up for Concerned Women for America, you will receive, trust me, many, many emails that will tell you who your, well, not in your case, but in my case, who your representative is, and it will provide you letters that have already been written, and all you have to do is print them off and sign it, fold it up, and mail it, or you can simply send the text of the letter through into an email. In a brochure that urges activism on behalf of CWA, former CWA President Wendy Wright recounts her arrest after she was protesting in front of an abortion clinic. And in America, there are certain rules that protests must take place, in certain states, I should say, that protesters have to stay a certain amount of space away from the doors of the clinic in order for that protest to be legal. And by the way, after the text of this particular speech, the audience is urged for a monetary donation. So if we want to know where this is building or what the ultimate outcome for the group is, this is asking for money. Okay. So here is Wendy Wright talking about what has happened to her and her arrest after protesting in front of an abortion clinic. So in her voice, she says, "I mentioned that I had been jailed for praying. When I was in Houston jailed for praying, the judge declared that I could be released from jail if I would simply agree not to do it again. If I promised that I would not pray in public at an abortion clinic again, I could leave jail. Importantly, note how many times she's repeated herself now. We've heard the same sentence about 4 times, but with different syntax, with different word order, right? I couldn't do that. I couldn't promise that. Most of the people in the prison system knew why I was there, and they knew this condition on my sentence. One time when I was walking down a long hallway to my cell, a big prison guard yelled out at me, "Don't be discouraged and don't give in to the judge." That's our charge tonight. Don't be discouraged and don't give in to those who would judge us for trying to keep our country free. Now, Wright's words here not only conflate prayer with sacrificial action, and here's that chaos rhetoric at work. Those two things become one and the same, right? But with freedom's very survival. The government is here the agent explicitly described as an oppressive vehicle, imposing inappropriate religious limitations. This is seen in Wright's description of her crime not as blocking the entrance to a clinic, which, by the way, is the actual thing she was arrested for, but as prayer. Do you see that? When I had been jailed for praying, no, she was jailed for being within 30 feet of a clinic. And so that's part of the rhetoric as well. The government is juxtaposed with Wright, who chooses to break the law and face incarceration over what she perceives to be the sacrifice of her Christian principles. Throughout the CWA website, a prominent theme is that a person cannot maintain his or her status as an upstanding patriotic Christian without doing something, without an activist response. It's not enough simply to agree. There must also be something that you do in response. And most usually this can transpire through a simple click on a link, again, through which you email your senator or your congressperson, or you can simply click on a link, enter your credit card information, and it's done. Those are everywhere on the CWA website. In fact, I found out for the first time who my local representatives were because of CWA. I had just moved to the area and I wasn't really sure, and I was investigating this group, and that was the way I found out. This is an important piece of instruction because this literally permits the persuaded reader to offer money or to offer a vote or to offer their political voice in almost painless fashion after reading an appeal such as this. So after the emotional impulse has been built, click, it's done, right? So we have seen then that through these rhetorical excerpts that the tactics of chaos rhetoric work synergistically. Chaos rhetoric employs extremely emotional symbols that polarize issues, right? That change eternal positions as the times demand, eternal, that deflect a more pressing rationale onto more persuasive agendas and themes, and that ultimately attempt to incite immediate activism at the very point when the reader's emotional level is highest. What this means is that chaos rhetoric's most important function in my mind is its flexibility. It's a sort of dynamism without which many social groups, quite frankly, could not weather the political storms. Now, for those who oppose the Christian right, for those who read this stuff and say, you have got to be kidding me, right? It might seem natural to argue that chaos rhetoric is a really dangerous, if not uniquely manipulative form of speech. But to construe groups that use chaos rhetoric as ones that are synonymous with danger or that they are morally degraded, this is not a necessary connection. Because frankly, almost all groups that seek to persuade the public use similar rhetorical techniques. So rather than offering an opinion on whether chaos rhetoric is morally appropriate or on the proper political role of CWA, I'd like to simply consider whether the chaos rhetoric that's at the center of CWA and Christian fundamentalism in general, I'd like to think with you for a moment about whether or not it's exceptional. Is it unique? And if not, what does this tell us about the significance of such groups, not only to American public life, but about the significance of right-wing movements internationally as well? So to investigate this, let's look at yet another piece of rhetoric from the organization that I mentioned earlier, the National Organization of Women, or NOW. Some people have considered NOW to be the anti-CWA, right? So they do stand in opposition to each other. They each cast each other as the bad guy. They each have roughly the same number of members, about 500,000 members each. CWA's own history invokes the National Organization of Women, which, by the way, was founded in 1966. And it self-describes as the largest organization of feminist activists in the United States. LaHaye claims to have founded CWA in part as a response to NOW's portrayal of women's rights, which she interpreted as extremist, offensive, and counter to the sensibilities of the average American woman. Now, although Now's activism is actually very multifaceted, they include things like reproductive rights, gender equity, economic concerns, an end to a number of different identity discriminations. CWA typically boils down now to abortion. In her own bit of chaos rhetoric, CWA President Penny Nance recently referred to Now members as, quote, out of their minds and, quote, completely blinded by ideology and a searing lust for a woman's right to choose to abort her child. So, with this context in mind, I want to show you now a new piece of rhetoric from Now, which responds to the media portrayal of Candace abortion, Dr. George Tiller. Tiller was shot to death in 2009 during a Sunday service at his church. So he was an usher in the church, the person who opens the door and helps people to find their seat, right? He was standing in the lobby of his church. A man named Scott Rader opened the door, came in, saw Tiller there, opened fire, and killed him in the hallway to his church. Scott Rader later claimed, who is, as you might imagine, in jail, claimed to be acting on behalf of aborted fetuses everywhere, and more specifically on behalf of the pro-life movement. So in this particular piece, author and then Now President Kim Gandy implicates in Tiller's death conservative political commentator Bill O'Reilly and his conservative TV show The O'Reilly Factor, which airs on Fox News, which is America's most conservative and also one of its most popular channels. As of a couple of years ago, The O'Reilly Factor was the most watched American news program on television. So to give you some feel for the weight of Bill O'Reilly, he is an absolutely controversial character, okay? In the weeks and even the years preceding Tiller's murder, O'Reilly had continuously referred to Tiller as, quote, the baby killer. And he had once barely stopped short of threatening to murder Tiller himself on the air. And then he stopped and said, oh, no, you know that I don't mean that. Americans, you know that I would never do anything like that. And so to this, Kim Gandy, now president, says this. Many have pointed to O'Reilly's loathsome jargon as a possible catalyst for the murder. O'Reilly and those like him will claim that their hateful rhetoric is nothing more than free speech and has no bearing on the actions of the man who murdered Dr. Tiller. But make no mistake, hate speech of this kind sets the stage for those who carry out the dirty work of the anti-abortion movement. And Tiller was murdered in public, not just to punish and halt Dr. Tiller himself, but to send a message to anyone who assists women in exercising their full reproductive rights. And one of the things that she reminds the reader in this particular piece is that abortion is legal, right? So Tiller was killed for performing a legal act. This was an act, she says, of domestic terrorism. And any terminology suggesting that Dr. Tiller may have had it coming is shameful. So just as we've seen CWA do this several times before, here we now have a liberal speaker using chaos rhetoric, right? To claim that the media is an entity that destroys truth. Gandy's claim is that conservative speech cannot be rendered legitimate, that is free speech, because it's hate speech. Her aim is to depict O'Reilly as not only misguided, but specifically deceptive. On one level, she's arguing that those like O'Reilly compromise public safety, for she openly links his hate speech to what she calls the dirty work, that is, murder. But more generally, O'Reilly also threatens the nation itself, she says, as displayed in her reference to his opinions and how they inspired a domestic terrorist. So Gandy portrays Tiller's death as the symbolic demise of a fundamental piece of American citizenship, that is, the realization of rights, legal rights, even the controversial ones. So comparing excerpts from CWA and Now illuminates how groups can have much different material and legal interests that they pursue, but they can still use the same rhetorical tactic to meet their goal of public persuasion. This does not mean, and this is very important, this does not mean that each group is using equally good data. They don't have equally good numbers. It does not mean that they're drawing equally sound or rational conclusions, but it simply means that their rhetoric mirrors one another in form and symbolic usage. But this piece, as well as all of the other ones that we've seen from CWA, question the ability of the opponent to ascertain truth and logic on matters of sex and reproduction. Both throw into question the opponent's moral righteousness. Both claim intentional deception. Both cast their opponent as an enemy, as a vehicle of public danger, and as a general threat to safety. And very importantly, both of them view their opponent as a challenge to the workings of the American nation. Now, in addition to political groups, we can also find this same tendency of chaos rhetoric amongst the very scholars who actually study the Christian right. Now, it may seem on the surface that scholars would be unlikely to use chaos rhetoric since they're supposed to maintain a degree of scholarly objectivity, but that's actually not the case at all. For scholars have their own agendas that they use to formulate the very categories that make their analyses possible. So for many scholars, this includes support for liberal political and also frequently liberal Protestant thought. These political allegiances are not difficult to detect because scholars often reveal them themselves in the prefaces of their books, in analyses that talk constantly about the dangers of conservative social thought, or still in other descriptions of conservatives that demarcate them as something distinct, illogical, or even aberrant when compared to the intellectual commitments of the academy. So this chaos rhetoric occurs in, frankly, a very wide number of ways. For a more obvious example, there is one scholar who calls conservatism's family values, quote, chilling and alien, causing her to ask, how can hate sound so nice? Similarly, another scholar calls conservative family policy demonic distortions that impede justice and well-being for many. And still another who in one work claims that conservative Christian politics have hijacked good evangelicalism's core. This person elsewhere refers to well-known American fundamentalist Jerry Falwell as a charlatan preacher who panders to rather than challenges the prejudices of their flocks and calls him an example of religious demagoguery. Now, very ironically, in his own chaos rhetoric about chaos rhetoric, another scholar notes that taking seriously inflammatory speech used by evangelicals undermines the very fabric of democracy, for chaos rhetoric creates an American public life where responses to insecurity and crippled politics consist of a rejection of reason, an abandonment of faith and reform, and a recourse to discourses of anger and panic. So do you see that this is chaos rhetoric about chaos rhetoric? Right? A chaos rhetoric then appearing on many levels. So whether or not one concludes that this is accurate is actually quite beside the point, again, for it's still chaos rhetoric at work. My point is simply that chaos rhetoric is not only very effective, but it's also ubiquitous. You and I use it every single day. I can say as a very common example, I use it against my kids all the time to get them to pick up their stuff. I'm taking this to the thrift store if you don't get your Legos picked up. I will, do this or that. These are common ways that we engage in chaos rhetoric. We pose a threat, we naturalize our actions, we portray the negative side as we successfully manipulate our own response to the situation as the politics demand. So almost everyone who wants to persuade is going to end up using these tactics at one point or another. So this brings us to a really important culminating final question. If CWA and the Christian right don't use unusual persuasive tactics, right? If they don't embrace significantly different theologies from other kind of mainstream Christian groups, nor are they more engaged, orthodox, or otherwise involved in the political process than other political groups, then what makes them different? The short answer for me is not much. In fact, the thing that seems to set the Christian right apart from other groups is simply the degree to which scholars and other public figures claim that the Christian right is set apart from other groups. In other words, the thing that seems to set them apart is the attention that they get from liberal scholars. So does this mean that no distinction exists? Well, no, that's not really the entire story either. What is likely distinct about the Christian right is how effective its chaos rhetoric actually is. Put another way, it is unique in its ability to practice this form of public persuasion because it has a pre-existing social authority that gives religious voices the right to speak in American culture. So whether it's claiming the authority of religion or the power to speak for women, as it regards gender and reproduction issues, the right to speak for children, as it frequently says it has, or moral agency in defense of the nation, CWA has at its disposal a very impressive arsenal of symbols that are powerful only to the degree that they appear simply to reflect the American mainstream. So through the rhetorics of both reason and religion and the careful crafting of its opponents' identities, CWA has very successfully invoked its exclusive authority to use these symbols to shape the nation in its own image. Its ability to, as we say, be all things to all people, and very convincingly so, is in my mind where it's so powerful. It can simply transform itself into whatever it needs to be at the moment, because it has already successfully claimed the right to speak about different symbols in a multitude of different ways. So with this said, what is perhaps not clear is whether CWA has merely reconstituted the preferences of American culture. In other words, do Americans really believe the things that CWA says they believe? It's hard to say. Or is it attempting to create that culture by saying, Americans, you believe this, right? Again, that's difficult to know. Asking whether language definitively creates or describes realities, of course, is kind of a chicken and egg question for which no certain answer emerges. But CWA's ability to successfully resonate with an American mainstream really forces scholars to reconsider the common notion that the Christian right is successful because it has these unwavering moral platforms and because it never changes, when in fact all evidence suggests, in fact, that the changes are frequent, if not constant, and they are sometimes even quite dramatic. So that is, in the end, one of the most formidable aspects of chaos rhetoric, that CWA can now successfully claim to be the representative of a very large swath of the nation, collapses the traditional with the modern, the conservative Christian with the progressive, the fringe or the radical with the populist, right? As is the case with power, Foucault notes, those who have it can very effectively manipulate what gets to count as the knowledge that comes from it. So in this sense, successfully claiming its own mainstream status, as well as setting the parameters or the boundaries for what should constitute a proper nation, guarantees the Christian right's enduring political relevancy. Thank you.